Welcome everyone to the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York. Today our webinar is Core Components of Effective Treatment for Youth with Depression with Dr. Anil Chakra. Before I introduce him, we just want to review some webinar logistics. Currently everybody is muted and will be muted for the duration of the webinar. However, we do ask you to share comments, questions, feedback, and there are going to be a couple times where we're going to ask you to specifically respond to certain questions. You will use the chat box in order to communicate with us. If you don't see a open chat box on the bottom right, if you go to hover over the bottom of your screen, you're going to see different icons and circles. There's a little bubble. If you click on that, that opens the chat box on the bottom right. When you chat with us, make sure that in the drop-down you hit send to all panelists so that we can the panelist presenter can see your questions, comments, and feedback. We will answer any questions that we can throughout the webinar, but we are holding off on questions also for our Q&A period that will be at the end, about the last 10 minutes of our hour. At the close of the webinar, there will be a feedback survey that pops up in your browser. We really strongly encourage you to complete that feedback survey so that we can continue to improve our trainings, webinars, and other offerings. We will also be recording this webinar, and the recording and the slides will be posted on our ctechny.org website. So now, without further ado, we're very excited to have Dr. Anil Chakra. He's an Associate Professor of Counseling Psychology at New York University. He's a clinical psychologist with extensive experience working with children and families in both clinical practice and research. His research focuses on the development of engaging, effective, and sustainable prevention, intervention, and service delivery models for youth at risk for or affected with disruptive behavior disorders and other mental health challenges. Thank you, Dr. Chakra, for being with us today.
And thank you, Lydia. So I just want to make sure that this is perfect. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about core components of effective treatment for youth with depression. And as part of the agenda, we have four points. One is I'm going to talk about Match ADTC, which is a protocol that has been developed by Bruce Chorpita and John Weiss. I will talk about why it's a useful framework in thinking about core components, both common elements as well as common processes for the treatment, specifically of depression, although the protocol actually addresses other common comorbid conditions like anxiety, trauma, and conduct problems. I will talk briefly about the use of measures when you're working with youth, both children and adolescents, and the importance of it, how that can be utilized for the purpose of not only baseline functioning but ongoing progress monitoring. We'll get into the main elements of the Match ADTC protocol for depression. We will not get through all the elements simply because there are quite a few, and we're limited in terms of time, but we will certainly discuss the main ones. And then, as was mentioned previously, we'll have a Q&A following at the very end. Okay. So for those of you who are familiar with Match, Match is a particular protocol, and it's a manualized intervention. And I guess the big question is why Match, and what is it? So if you've been in the field for some time, you know that there's been a development, a plethora of manualized interventions for treating various disorders, including depression. Alan Kasdan had noted that there are probably 500 different types of treatments available for youth in general, and there are probably 200 to 300 different kinds of manuals across the board. And what Bruce Chorpita and his colleagues, John Weiss and others, have done is to really think about what are the common elements across these particular manuals and what are the common processes that are used to work with youth. And Bruce Chorpita and John Weiss distilled the most common elements and processes to use for the treatment of anxiety, depression, trauma, and conduct problems, and then have manualized this within this MATCH ADTC protocol. All right. So if you can chat in, two things to consider. What do you think are the most common elements used to treat depression in children and adolescents? And then what do you think are the most common processes used within treatment to convey knowledge and skills? So you can chat, and again, please include all participants or panelists for your response.
Great, thank you. So just as a reminder, your chat box is on the bottom right. If you don't see that chat box for some reason, click the little bubble icon that's in the center of your screen at the bottom so that chat box can open up. Sometimes it takes about a few seconds for us to receive any comments, but please go ahead and chat in. And I think there's a couple coming up now.
Okay, so I see here CBT therapies in general, group therapy, CBT. So I'd like for everyone to think a little bit more specifically, not just an intervention approach, but think about the components. So if you're teaching a particular skill, what skill do you think are most commonly taught when treating depression in children and adolescents? So I see resiliency, resourcing, positive regard, rapport, redirection of negative thinking, play therapy, DBT, positive reinforcement, emotion regulation. Okay. So all good points. Behavioral activation, distress tolerance. Great. So let's talk a little bit about what Torpeda, Weiss, and their colleagues found to be most commonly used elements for treating depression in children and adolescents. So in 2009, Bruce Torpeda and Eric Daladin conducted a study where they reviewed the entire literature focused on not only depression, broadly than that, but we'll focus here on depression, and had categorized all the potential elements that were used and then essentially combined them to see how frequently were they used. So if you look at this particular slide, you can see that on the very top it says frequency of the practice element, if it's used 0% of the time across treatment manuals, or if it's used up through 100% of the time. And what they found was, in decreasing order of frequency, that approaches focused on cognitions were most often used, over 75% of the time. Psychoeducation, activity scheduling, working on maintenance, problem solving, self-monitoring, goal setting were probably the most common. And then all the way to the bottom, there are tangible rewards, explicit work on relationship and rapport building, assertiveness training, etc. So what they decided, and this is a particular approach, was since most of the intervention manuals utilized a common set of elements, they determined whether those particular elements were effective in improving outcomes, and they essentially took these elements and packaged them into an algorithm for the treatment of depression, again, anxiety, trauma, and conduct problems. So this next slide shows you this one treatment arm. So if you notice here, there are in the blue are specific common elements that I mentioned earlier in the previous slide. They are ordered in a particular way. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ordering of these particular elements. And there's some decision points. So if we look through this, there's really a four-step process. And I want you to look at this slide from left to right. You can see that the first set of elements or sessions focus on getting acquainted around depression and learning about depression, both from the child and parent perspective. And this is really psychoeducation, and we're going to get into why this is important not only for depression but in general. Once a clinician works with the parent and child around psychoeducation, learning what depression is about, learning what CBT for depression would look like, there is a discussion as to whether they understand it enough and agree to treatment and are able to proceed. In that box right in the middle are the core, really active elements of treatment components for depression. On the left side, you'll see that there's problem solving, activity scheduling, learning to relax, and quick calming. These tend to be very behavioral elements. So things that focus to the sort of low-hanging fruit, approaches that can help rather quickly in addressing some of the main issues around mood and mood regulation. Following this, in that box on the right side, there's the cognitive piece, presenting a positive self, cognitive blue, which is a set of a way in which to think about negative thoughts, and then cognitive TLC, which is a way of self-care. Once that's done, the final sort of concluding elements focus on future maintenance, so plans for coping, wrapping up, etc. And it's important to recognize this is just one arm of the manual. There's also a separate algorithm for anxiety, trauma, and conduct problems, and they're integrated. I'm presenting this as a standalone treatment arm, but there's an integration across the 4 disorders that this particular manual works on. Okay. So I just want to highlight a case that I'll just refer to as we go through some of these slides. So Benny, this is a case that I saw recently. Benny's it's a rather straightforward, simple case just for the sake of illustration. Benny's an 11-year-old Asian male who presented for treatment issues regarding sadness, isolation, decrease in appetite, disrupted sleep. He complained of a lack of friends and loneliness, disinterest in activities, and increasing irritable mood. He comes from an intact family with one sibling who is functioning well. Over the past school year, his grades have dropped, and his parents are concerned about his academic and social functioning further deteriorating. Moreover, his challenges have impacted his parents and overall family functioning. So he came in for treatment. He was diagnosed with depression. They're sort of classic symptoms and signs of depression and functioning. All right, so we're going to be using Benny as a case just to highlight a couple of things. Before we get into the match manual itself, I would just want to talk briefly about assessing baseline functioning and progress monitoring. So again, if we go back to the chat box, I'd like for you to think about, and just briefly, what are the benefits of assessing baseline functioning and ongoing monitoring, and what are some of the challenges of assessing baseline functioning and ongoing monitoring? And again, please chat to all panelists to pose your questions.
Okay, I think we have some chat.
I think, yeah. So I think everybody is on the same page here, which is essentially you want to be able to both assess baseline functioning and then ongoing monitoring in order to determine whether what you're doing is effective. And one of the biggest challenges often in clinical practice is monitoring progress. We know from some pretty substantial data across different types of populations that anywhere from about 10 to 20% of kids deteriorate when in treatment. So 1 out of 10 or 2 out of 10 kids will get worse over the course of treatment. And it is pretty difficult to predict ahead of time at baseline alone. So this just speaks to the need to make sure that we are monitoring their functioning, both not only for the purpose of whether we're seeing if treatment is working, but if it's not working, that we're aware of that it's not working, and then we collaboratively work with the youth and their family to make changes about our treatment plan. Okay. So what are the kinds of measures we could use? I just identified a few that I've used in my clinical practice. There are certainly many other depression measures that assess sort of classical depression. These are just a few. These are free, so if you are interested in downloading these, they're usually pretty readily available online. But how do you make depression monitoring work? So there's a couple of key points. We can use the measure as it is. So for the measures, we can read through the items to make sure what's being assessed maps onto the child's difficulties. And certainly some measures are going to be better than others. Oftentimes I'll notice that there is an item on a measure that's particularly problematic as reported by the youth. And then I'll use that, a single item, and ask it repeatedly before every session, and that's often pretty useful. And then, of course, there are idiographic ways of measuring, meaning specific to the youth and the parent perspective and not normed. Typically, these are things that are sort of problems in daily life functioning. So you can talk about things like time spent with others could be a particular goal. That's typically not going to be seen in a traditional measure of depression, but that might be an important goal that's identified by the parent or youth. Those kinds of self-identified goals can be placed along a continuum, so you can much more easily measure progress or deterioration. There are often anchors that we place. So what I mean by anchors is behavioral descriptors across the 1 to 10 point scale. So if you have 1 being worse functioning and 10 being better functioning, and the item is time spent with people, a 1 would be completely by yourself for hours on end, and a 10 would be something like spending the vast majority of the day with friends and family. And you would have behavioral anchors all along that continuum as a way of making things as concrete as possible for the child and their family. Typically, if we're going to have self-identified goals or behaviors from either the parent or youth, it's best to focus on 2 or 3 at most. Focus on both positive and negative behaviors, so spending more time versus just spending time alone. And we certainly want to focus on, at least initially, thinking about behaviors that are not so difficult to change. We want to be able to identify behaviors that are sensitive to change, and that's really important in terms of motivation for families and for youth to continue in treatment. And then this is, so for instance, as I mentioned before, here's a particular behavior, engaging in activities with parents and siblings, and you can anchor this from 1 to 10 with some behavioral anchors. And it could certainly be more descriptive than no interaction or a lot of interaction, but for the sake of this, the amount of space that we have on this slide, this will suffice. Okay. So monitoring is really important. You can do it in different kinds of ways. You can use measures. You can use items for measures. And I have certainly found that in addition to those, having some idiographic child or parent identified behavioral goals is often helpful. All right. And now let's talk about the practice elements. All right. If you recall from the earlier slide, I had mentioned that the first part of the protocol for depression is getting acquainted. So why do we do this, or why is it included in the protocol? It's to ensure ultimately that there are clear expectations, and the goal is to work closely and collaboratively to make sure that we understand multiple perspectives and clarify the process roles and expectations. So we know that when expectations are not met, it often leads to frustration, and frustration leads to disappointment, and disappointed people don't engage in treatment. So accurate and clear expectations are critical early on in treatment. You can almost call it a start to the treatment contract. Oftentimes, individuals in different kind of mental, not only mental, but in healthcare interactions initially with the provider, have a set of expectations about how things are going to look, what the rate and progress of improvement will be, how people are going to be involved, to what extent they're going to be involved. All these kinds of thoughts and expectations often influence early engagement and treatment. So getting at that is particularly important. Making sure that everybody's on the same page is particularly important. In the healthcare field, in medicine, interactions between general practitioners or pediatricians, primary care physicians, and their patients, this process is very similar. And there's a lot of literature around clarifying expectations and making sure that people's understanding of what they're going to be involved in is absolutely clear. So for us, the goals here, let me just go to the next slide. The steps and goals are pretty clear and pretty straightforward. They don't necessarily have to be in this particular order, but certainly one should talk about in broad strokes what is the purpose, the rationale for the work that you're doing, ensuring that we have a better understanding and clarification around expectations about what treatment look like, who's involved and what will be, how they'll be involved in treatment, and what will be done in and outside of sessions. So oftentimes parents may expect that they're going to be minimally involved, or they're going to be involved in some things but not others. Kids may expect that all they're going to be doing is perhaps talking to someone about their problems and not learning particular skills. Oftentimes individuals are surprised that there are a set of skills that we want them to practice outside of the sessions. So if these things are not discussed, then they become a surprise. And if they are an unpleasant surprise, they certainly can impact individuals' engagement in subsequent sessions. So this is actually a step that's used or that is recommended across the board for various children's mental health, youth mental health problems, is this idea of clarifying expectations and making sure roles, processes, et cetera, are really clear prior to the start of any active work. Okay. So the next step that we have here is, and someone just said, also trust. So thank you for mentioning that. Part of this early on experience is rapport building, relationship building, making sure people feel that they can trust you, can trust what you're doing, that they understand that you're the right person to do this kind of work. And building that trust is particularly important early on. Well, it's important throughout, but certainly early on in the process, especially if this is a youth's first time in formal mental health services. Okay. The next common element after this sort of introductory getting acquainted is learning about depression itself. The goal here is we certainly want to foster an understanding of the framework used for treatment. The main underlying foundational model of the work based on this particular manual is the relationship between thoughts, feelings, or emotions, and behaviors. And it is important for youth and their parents to have this framework so they can go back to this in treatment and rely on this particular framework when considering what they need to do to help improve functioning. And so ultimately, conversations about different kinds of skills, or in the way it's worded in this particular manual, are tools. The way in which different tools are discussed are always in the framework of this particular triad, the triad of emotion, behavior, and cognition. So there are a set of steps that help facilitate this understanding. We first help the child understand that depression has three parts. This is the feeling, thinking, and doing. It's what we feel, what we think, and what we do. We will role play with them times where they felt sad, mad, or upset, the associated feelings and their behaviors associated with those particular feelings. There's normalization of the whole process. Kids certainly sometimes may feel that the level of sadness that they have is unique and unique to them. Certainly everyone feels sad from time to time, or mad, upset, etc. We talk to them about different tools to help feel better. Some of these, going back to that triad, work on feelings directly or emotions. Others work directly on behaviors, and other tools work directly on thoughts. And we talk to youth about what are the existing tools that they currently use. So it may be the case that youth already do certain things to elevate their mood, or have tried things that they no longer continue to use in the past that helped with their moods. We talk about the importance of homework. We ask them about how feelings look. So feelings certainly look different for different people. So how does a child look when they feel a certain way? This certainly helps children to have a better sense of their own expression of mood, which helps with monitoring, and monitoring is really important. So helping them understand how their feelings look, how it presents, is really important as you continue treatment around monitoring and trying to determine changes in mood. And then the last thing here is getting youth to monitor their moods in between sessions. This is the first active skill-based work that is part of this particular manual. And importantly, we certainly recognize that a lot of work happens within session, but a session, a 45-minute or 50-minute session, is only a smidgen of time relative to everything that youth experience in their day-to-day lives. So ensuring that they are practicing skills is important, and monitoring how they're feeling. For this particular manual, it's a feeling thermometer, but certainly you can utilize other kinds of monitoring tools. I think I see here someone uses an app, and there are certainly a lot of apps out there to monitor moods. And given what our youth and their engagement in mobile technology is like, I'm sure that will probably be an easier way versus pen and paper. All right. So after the early stages, which is really around psychoeducation and learning about CBT and learning about what you're going to be doing, the first active step is problem solving. So sometimes the easiest way of addressing things is to come up with practical solutions to problems that can be readily addressed. And problem solving, I think in many ways, everyone problem solves. That's part of life. We know that people who are depressed often have difficulties with thinking systematically to solve problems. So there's been work done by DiZarilla at NAZU. This goes back into the 1980s, where they found significant differences between individuals who are depressed and who are not depressed on their ability to problem solve, including each step of being able to identify a problem, define it clearly, generate solutions, examine or evaluate the merit of each solution, implementing something and evaluating its effectiveness. Across the board, those are pretty standard problem-solving steps, but individuals who are depressed during their depression often have a real difficult time with each of these steps. So the goal here for problem solving is teaching a skill that can be utilized right away in a systematic way that can address some problems that are relatively easy to solve as a way of gaining some motivation. So how do we do this? There are certainly different acronyms that are used to solve problems. I may just skip one point here. One, just like when we talked earlier about, or I spoke earlier about normalizing feelings, we all problems, saying that people have problems. Problems are part of life, whether you're depressed or not depressed, whether you're young or old. Problems are going to be part of challenges that everyone faces. Importantly, It is how we solve problems. That's important. So let me tell you a little bit about Benny, the case vignette that I had earlier. And this can actually fall under problem solving or activity scheduling. I put this under problem solving. We addressed it in different ways with activity scheduling. I taught Benny this problem-solving step, which is STEPS. There are other acronyms out there, but essentially they fall under these 5 steps. Saying what the problem is, so very clearly defining it. Sometimes individuals, especially young children, will bring in other information that is actually not central to the problem. So being able to solve a problem means that you can clearly articulate what is the problem and what's not the problem. So saying what the problem is, coming up or brainstorming of potential solutions, examining or weighing the pros and cons of each solution, picking one, and it doesn't necessarily have to be one. It can be a combination of multiple solutions and trying it out and seeing how it worked. So Benny had a problem in which he was in a new grade, in a new class, and he didn't see his friends much. That's what we identified as the problem, although he talked about it in very roundabout ways. We thought of several solutions and had his parents actually also come into the session to assist us afterwards in order to brainstorm some additional solutions, and that's often helpful. More minds at times are helpful. We thought of a potential solution that was a combination of ideas that we generated. We picked one out, or a combination of multiple out. We came up with having him join some after-school activities that he knew his friends were already involved in, and making explicit play dates, which seems common sense. I mean, a lot of parents do that, but in his particular culture, we had to discuss it with his parents because it was not culturally congruent with his family's lifestyle and the way they grew up, and so there was some discussion around that. It certainly worked to elevate his mood, which is also part of activity scheduling we'll get into. So once we teach the steps, we practice them, we elicit personal example, as I just mentioned with Benny, and we try to problem solve. He was asked to try to take this work home and actually implement the skill. And then we shared, in this case, the parent was already involved in the session once we started generating some solutions. But certainly we want parents to be involved to help support or foster implementation of any solutions that we come up with. So problem solving is certainly a ubiquitous process that we all use. Again, for individuals with depression, problem-solving ability in a systematic way is often altered and is not as systematic and is not as helpful. So certainly we want to teach this explicitly, even if kids have had pre-morbid, good functioning around problem solving. Sometimes those skills become sort of lax when they are depressed. So activity scheduling. So again, another behavioral common element for the treatment of depression is scheduling activities that are both pleasant, and or where a child or youth has mastery. So the way in which we engage with the world impacts our mood. So this is, again, very behavioral. You're getting people to do things where it's pleasurable or they have mastery over. So people who often get depressed disengage from others or do less things that provide true pleasure or a sense of competency and mastery. They end up doing low-level pleasurable activities that actually don't improve their mood significantly. Like, it's not uncommon for people to watch TV, to sleep more, to play video games by themselves, etc., disengage from people. If you ask any kid would they like to play video games, yes. Would they like to watch TV? Yes. But individuals who are depressed will isolate themselves. And relative to other kinds of activities, watching TV or playing video games or doing things in isolation don't have the same level of pleasure or certainly not the same level of mastery relative to other activities. So we really try to introduce mood-elevating activities, helping individuals, helping kids understand the link between what we do and how we feel, identifying activities that people can do that increase enjoyment and mastery, and ultimately trying to insert those systematically into your routine for the week. All right. So here, let's have a little chat in. Hold on one sec. I might have skipped. No, that is it. Okay. So let's chat in here. What kinds of activities have you found to be helpful for children and adolescents to help elevate mood? So I'd like to hear different kinds of activities that you have found working with kids and working with adolescents separately, because they certainly engage in different kinds of activities that you have found elevate mood. So coloring and drawing, playing sports is a big thing, dancing, arts, physical activities. Certainly there's a lot of benefit in terms of just endorphins that are released by doing active things like sports and dancing. Spending time with pets, music, adolescents and shopping, it's always good. Spending time with other people, like dinner with the family or one-to-one time with the parent. All those are great kinds of things. So we certainly want to keep in mind that you all have had experience with kids and adolescents and adults. We were all kids and adolescents at one time. We want to think and have in our toolkit some ideas for the types of activities that we think can elevate mood. And the important piece here is to remember that the four types of activities that are often helpful are activities that people used to enjoy, and eliciting those. Oftentimes individuals with depression don't do the things that they used to do in the past that they enjoyed. Doing activities with someone you like is also very important, helpful in terms of elevating mood. Activities that keep you busy and are of interest to you, where you have some mastery, always is often helpful in elevating mood. And then activities that help someone else. Often there's a lot of research around giving back and the pleasure that people feel by doing that. So it's often the case that kids understand that fun activities make them feel happier. The challenge is getting them to actually identify them and then actually implement them. In this particular intervention, let me just go back because I do feel like I might have went over this too quickly. We want to not only educate youth in different activities, we want to connect activities and feelings. So we often will tell kids, imagine that you are in a stressful event. You can recreate that with the child and have them rate their mood. And then immediately afterward, engage in a fun activity and have them rate their mood. This contrast often helps them just see the connection, although a lot of kids on their own will tell you they often feel better when they do something that's fun. We certainly want them to identify a list of pleasant activities, and oftentimes, in no less than 10. We want those things to be simple, free, and available, and things that make people feel good. And as much as possible during the take-home or the skill-based work, have them not only implement that, but also rate their mood after they do these pleasurable activities. Oftentimes it's helpful, again, to enlist the help from parents, because they are the gatekeepers often, especially for children, of their schedules, and so eliciting input from parents and problem solving and really thinking through any practical barriers that get in the way of doing these things and scheduling them in the week is really helpful. All right. So learning to relax. So why is this important? We want to assist children in understanding situations that may elicit tension or difficulties, and to use methods to relax the body. So part of it is understanding somatic cues, what your body is telling you, understanding why it's beneficial to stay calm and relaxed, and then using particular methods to address any cues that tell you your body is tensing up. And how do we go about this? Perhaps for many of you, this is now sort of common practice for anxiety and depression and anger and a whole bunch of areas where emotion regulation is difficult. There's certainly many ways of doing this. In this particular protocol, they talk about discussing feelings and how it affects the body. So understanding where it is that you're feeling tense and how do you feel when you're tense. Importantly, kids feel tension in different ways. Sometimes it's heaviness. Sometimes it feels like it's a wrenching or a twisting feeling. And certainly it will vary in terms of where it's felt. Sometimes it's in the shoulders, sometimes in the neck, sometimes in the back, sometimes all over, sometimes it's just in their head or their face, tension headaches. And then we talk about several different kinds of muscle relaxation approaches that can be used. There are various methods of doing this. Typically, I utilize progressive muscle relaxation with contrasting tense and relaxed body parts. Usually major body parts, it's much easier to start off with, and then as you progress with a child, you can get into the minor body parts and have a little bit more of a distinction, and that's often helpful, particularly for adolescents, but if a child is still continuing not to benefit from progressive muscle relaxation with the large body parts. The big piece of all this is taking it home, sharing with the parents, making sure that they practice this outside of when they're feeling tense. More practice is better, and scheduling that in. Often kids will find that they like doing this and it becomes a pleasurable activity to try out and actually implement schedule into their weekly routine. Once this happens, once we have this particular session or two sessions talking about this, you can certainly add other kinds of methods, like body mapping was essentially just body scanning, a way of really paying attention to where in your body you're feeling tension or other kinds of discomfort. Using imagery, deep breathing, and its combination in addition to progressive muscle relaxation. Okay. Then cognitive strategies. So people often think with CBT or with approaches that are cognitive that is often taught first. And certainly when we talk about psychoeducation and getting kids ready and prepared to start treatment, we talk about the CBT triad, which includes cognitions or thoughts. The early part of treatment for at least this particular manual and CBT in general for a lot of different kinds of populations focus on behavioral work first. In this case, for this particular manual, it's problem solving, it's activity scheduling, it's methods to regulate your body through progressive muscle relaxation and other kinds of approaches. At the very end, the idea here is that kids have a lot of tools in their tool belt that can help them elevate their mood, relax their body, get engaged with other people, and solve minor to moderate problems so they are functioning much better. Cognitive work with young kids in particular can be challenging, and it's doubly challenging when their mood is really low. So that's why a lot of the early on sessions are focused on behavioral approaches. Once we get to the very end, there are several cognitive strategies that are used. We're just going to be talking here about what they call blue thoughts in this particular manual. So what's the goal? Why do we do cognitive strategies? It's ultimately to fully address that CBT triad, the relationship between thinking and feeling and behaviors, but in this case, thinking and feeling, and to figure out how we modify our thoughts so we can modify or improve our feelings. The key goals here is really understanding the model, identifying negative automatic thoughts, being able to actually label them if possible. We'll talk a bit about that, and then evaluate the evidence for them, and then generate more realistic alternatives. So how to? So we know there's an analogy that's used in this particular session that works with dark glasses or shades. So the clinician is asked to have the child put on some dark glasses or dark shades and ask them, what do you see, and what does the world around you look like? Often it's going to be skewed, inaccurate, blurry. And this is an analogy just to say the way we see the world also affects how we perceive things and how we interpret things, and ultimately how we feel. And oftentimes when in session we'll have kids wear shades and then take them off and then say, how does it feel? How does it look? How do you perceive the world when you have them on or off? There are different kinds of analogies that get essentially at the same point. There's a filter analogy, which is your brain is like a filter. When you're feeling a certain way, it lets certain things in and doesn't allow certain things. There's a magnet analogy, which is you pay attention to things that confirm the way you believe or the way you think, and then you repel or don't pay attention to things that don't align with the way you think. And these are often useful strategies to help kids understand that our brain doesn't take in everything. It takes in certain things, and a lot of that has to do with the way our mood is to begin with. And certain thoughts get in that make our moods even worse. So there's an acronym that's used in Project Match called Blue Thoughts. It's blaming myself, looking for bad news, unhappy, guessing, and exaggerating. So blaming yourself is taking too much personal responsibility for negative events. So in Benny's case, he would often blame himself for issues between his friends. Looking for bad news is paying attention to only the negative, going back to that filter or magnet analogy, and discounting the positive. Benny, the vignette, the case example that I had mentioned earlier, he would be overly sensitive to what he perceived as slights and rejection from peers. He would often say that nothing good happened with my friends today. Unhappy guessing would be expecting bad outcomes, and we don't really know what will happen. So he would often assume that if he tried to engage with others, he would be rejected. Exaggerating, you make things seem worse than they are. Any slight, any perceived slight from anyone, adults, kids, friends, siblings, he would make it out to seem it's the worst thing that could ever happen. Obviously, that often led to him feeling sad, avoiding people, and withdrawing. So understanding or capturing, identifying what your thoughts are the first step for cognitive strategies. After that, you connect it to feelings. The way you think often impacts the way you feel. So if that's true, what can we do about our thoughts? This is not trying to replace thoughts, negative thoughts, with positive ones, but really trying to challenge them and come up with more realistic thoughts. So once we identify a problematic thought, we talk about what's the evidence that it's true? What's the evidence that it's not true? Is there another way to look at it? What would you tell a friend who had this thought? And if it's true, what's the worst that could happen? Obviously, this is not an exhaustive set of Socratic questions, but some of the useful ones that I use and the manual suggests to help individuals think about, identify a negative thought, automatic thought, and then come up with other ways of thinking about it, and then ultimately coming up with a more realistic way of thinking about or a realistic thought. Of course, we should also not forget that feelings can be altered by not just addressing thoughts, but actively engaging with people and in pleasant activities. And that is a major part of the strategy for cognitive work. As I mentioned before, there are certainly other cognitive strategies that are used, and it's certainly always, at least in this manual and a lot of kid work, is often used at the end after a lot of behavioral practice has been done. All right, now we are at the end of this set of slides. As I mentioned before, there are certainly other kinds of elements that are useful in the Match manual, but these are the core ones. And I'll stop here and see if there are any questions that folks have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taco. Folks, you can use the chat box again to submit your questions or your comments for our presenter. So please feel free to do that now. We have a few minutes before the end of the hour. We did have a question that came in earlier that wanted to know what was the manual that you referenced. I'm wondering if you want to go to the resources page and just walk through that.
Yep. So Let me do that. Thank you, Lydia. So this is the resources page. The Friedberg and McClure manual, the 2015 manual, this gives you a lot of general, really good practices, including broader than CBT. I teach a CBT course for school counselors, and I've gotten a lot of good feedback from students about this. The manual that we have discussed is the second point, is Trapita and Weiss's modular approach to therapy for children with anxiety, depression, trauma, or conduct problems. It is called the Match Manual, the Match ADTC for anxiety, depression, trauma, or conduct. It is available through PracticeWise. If you just Google PracticeWise, you'll see that they sell the manual both in a text version and also an electronic version. One of the things that I'll say that I think is very useful with this manual is that it is very user-friendly. So there are every session has a set of checklists and some prompts. So it gives you some guidance, but is not overly constrictive. The electronic version is point and click, so you can navigate the manual, each of the areas, as well as each of the elements just by pointing and clicking. Everything is hyperlinked. So if you're going to purchase this, I would certainly recommend the electronic version just for ease of sort of manipulating the material.
Great, and I think we have some questions coming in. So one is, do you have advice for working with depressed youth who happens to be on the spectrum and shuts down and claims she has tried everything?
Yeah, so my experience with children who are on the spectrum is that the cognitive work is very difficult. And this is where the behavioral work tends to be much more important. And I would certainly encourage folks to stay with the behavioral work as much as possible. It's not a satisfactory answer, I know that, but the cognitive piece, because it is a pervasive the cognitive issues are pervasive, and they're distinctly different than typically developing kids. The cognitive piece of the work, should you use a CBT approach, is not as, at least my understanding of the literature, is that it's not as effective. So I would encourage folks to work more on the behavioral end, more on approaches that regulate emotion, and working very closely with collaterals to ensure that kids are practicing those behavioral skills, activity scheduling, problem solving, muscle relaxation, deep breathing, all that behavioral work.
Great, thank you. And please feel free to keep submitting any questions that you may have. Another one came in that says, how can you teach kids skills on how to correct behavior or change their thoughts to a more positive outlook?
Yeah, so part of this is, so if we're trying to teach new skills, one thing that's particularly I have found useful, and it's borrowed from Alan Kasdan's work, is using a lot of behavioral practice with rewards. So I'll just use this example. When you're trying to teach a kid how to use a particular social skill, like telling someone that they're upset in a socially appropriate way, only practicing that during times that they're upset is going to lead to failure, because once emotions go high, cognitions are limited, and the ability to utilize or behave in a certain way that they have not learned explicitly becomes very difficult. So Alan Kasdan will say that if you know that you have a kid who needs to use appropriate social skills, you practice that with them during times where it is downtime, where there isn't any heightened emotion, when it isn't, quote-unquote, a real situation, and you reward them for doing that. And the more practice you have, then you can prompt them during the, quote, real situations to use those particular skills. In terms of the cognitive piece is not relatively speaking, is not as easy as the behavioral piece to teach young kids, but a lot of this is utilizing the sessions as much as possible, coming up with or identifying real-world examples that the child brings in, oftentimes including the parents in the session to teach them to skill so they can be, quote, a therapist for the kid when they're out, in their life at home, in peer situations, et cetera. The more that there is scaffolding by an adult, and typically, obviously, as a therapist, you can't be everywhere with the child. The more scaffolding there is around these skills, and usually what that means is with the caregiver, the more likely a child is going to be able to, one, remember to do it, have the support they need to actually implement the skills as intended.
Great, thank you. I do have a general question, too, if there's any nuances in the recommendations that you've given with a younger child versus an older child or adolescent, right? So are there any sort of nuances or changes to some of your recommendations depending on the age?
Yeah, so the big thing, as I mentioned before, is the cognitive work is oftentimes pretty limited, less robust with young kids. And when I say young kids, I'm referring to preschoolers, kindergartners, et cetera, and older kids being teenagers. I think that part of the work for younger kids often includes really explicit skills on emotion identification and labeling. Young kids, emotions or emotion vocabulary is a developmental skill, so it gets better. Our ability to identify what an emotion is, which emotion it is accurately, is something that gets better over time. And so for a lot of kids, particularly around anger, sadness, there are limited vocabulary around what they're actually experiencing, and that makes it tough to be able to support a child. And so for the young kids, we certainly will say, in addition to all this kind of behavioral work, there's a lot of explicit teaching around what are different emotions, what does your body say when you're feeling these different emotions, and how do you react when it's mad versus sad versus jealous versus whatever the other emotion is. And so I certainly think those are probably big distinctions, more for the younger kids than for the older youth. The older youth, this sort of protocol works, probably better.
Great, thank you. We're about at the end of our time. I'm wondering, there's one question that came in around advice for a teen who is missing their father, who they haven't seen, and their association with depression. It's a little specific, but I don't know if you have any suggestions there.
Yeah, so grief is I would say a different process, and certainly a lot of the kinds of thoughts that one has are I would say both accurate, but they can be negative in terms of taking to the extreme. I think for grief, my understanding is that a lot of it will be what's beneficial is supportive psychotherapy, really connecting with other adults that are existing in the individual's, the teenager's life, providing some skills for them to have to communicate with the adolescent about this loss. But certainly this loss for individuals in general, but particularly for teenagers, is very difficult and something not necessarily you can't necessarily change cognitions around this. Some of this might be very accurate, even though it's to the extreme. So just to repeat what I said, I would certainly say best practices are supportive psychotherapy, connecting with other adults, providing adults the skill sets necessary to have real deep conversations with an adolescent who has lost someone, and to give them the space that they need to be able to grieve appropriately.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Tacco. It's been a wonderful presentation. I hope everybody found your recommendations helpful, and we'll follow up with some of the resources that were listed. We're at the end of our webinar. I'm just going to make some closing comments. We have a couple other CTAC webinars coming up. Tomorrow's Adaptive Leadership and Organizational Change. Later in the month, we're going to talk about parent involvement in child welfare. You can go to our website at ctacny.org to register. And as a reminder, today's webinar recording and slides will be posted on that same website. Again, ctacny.org. And this is our emails. So Dr. Chaco's email, if you'd like to reach out to him directly, as well as if you have any questions around CTAC, our trainings, offerings, or webinars themselves, you can contact us through our ctac.info email as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking time out of your day to participate with us. And a feedback survey will pop up now as you close out. Please take the time to complete that as we do review those. Thank you so much again, and thank you again, Dr. Chaco.
Thank you. Bye now.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.